A Dance with Dragons has rapidly been rising in my estimation of the A Song of Ice and Fire series. When I first read the books, it was one of my least favorite. And nowadays, I think it's probably up there as one of my favorites, if not my favorite. I'm not sure on that. But regardless, it is not without its flaws. Its biggest fault at the moment is the fact that it doesn't have a sequel, but I mean, hopefully that fault is going to be solved at some point in the future. Who knows? We'll see. That said, barring that singular potential, hopefully solved issue, the main problem I have with A Dance with Dragons is that it doesn't really have an ending. Throughout this really great novel, we have fantastic character arcs for a number of different characters. However, the actual events and plot of the book seems to continue to build and build and build to this natural climax of these four different battles that Martin has kind of created and set up throughout the latter half of this novel. However, we see none of these four battles actually eventuate in A Dance with Dragons. It creates something of a structural issue with the book, as it seems to be a roller coaster that goes all the way up and then leaves you all the way up there without any sort of payoff for the very long novel before it. That is not to say that just because a novel is slow, that novel is bad. A Feast for Crows is probably the slowest novel in the series, and it's also my favorite. It has wonderful character moments throughout, and I like Dance for a lot of the same reasons. However, in this instance, given that it's such a longer book than Feast, and that it covers A, more main characters, and B, a lot more in the way of actual events taking place in the world. It seems as though all of these things would naturally end in some sort of massive conflict that we do see hints of throughout the latter half of the book and the massive build-up to the various battles as they're going to happen in the Winds of Winter now. But having them removed from Dance with Dragons just makes this part of the story feel fairly unfinished. While that is naturally part of being an ongoing series, though some would prefer to call this probably not ongoing because Winds of Winter has taken so long, but it is, for lack of a better term, still ongoing. I think that the main issue that this creates for Martin is the fact that he's been able to sit on these battles for so long. He's been writing the Winds of Winter for nearly 13 years now, and for all 13 of those years, he's probably gone back and forth on what is going to happen in these battles. They're very important to the story, and they involve a massive number of viewpoint characters. Given that, it makes sense that he'd probably change his mind and want to rewrite elements of them. These will be probably massive undertakings. I'm saying massive a lot in this video, but it's cool. And I think that having them still in the editing phase has probably slowed Martin's work a fair bit. I now want to go in depth on each of these battles a little bit and discuss them more in detail, as well as what I think they would have added to Dance with Dragons and whether or not I think they'd be well done in the Winds of Winter regardless. I'm going to go through in order of best to worst in terms of excluded for Dance with Dragons. So the first one I list, I'm actually kind of okay with it being the Winds of Winter. The last one I list, I very much think it should have been in A Dance with Dragons. But overall, it will be interesting to speculate on these battles, and given the fact that we do have some information about each of them, but still not very much. I should also say something before we get into the battles themselves, that being that each of them has a name given to them by fans, and I'll tell you those names as well as briefly recapping what's going on with each. The Battle of Fire takes place in Slaver's Bay. This is between Daenerys' forces and the forces of Yunkai and the other slaving nations are surrounding it, trying to strike back against Daenerys for disrupting their way of life. There's the Battle of Ice, which is between the Freys, and the Boltons in the snow up north of Winterfell. He is in the Crofters village, currently awaiting them to come to him. There's the Battle of Blood, which is between Euron and the Red Wine Fleet, likely taking place in and around Old Town. And there is the Battle of Steel, which takes place around Storm's End, with Aegon and Jon Connington attempting to seize this massive castle and really get a foothold in Westeros to hopefully take over the entire continent. Which of these battles are you looking forward to the most? I'd love to hear your opinion in the comments below. While you're down there, like, subscribe, YouTube stuff. The first conflict to discuss is the Battle of Blood. I personally am quite happy with the fact that the Battle of Blood is in the Winds of Winter. That conflict has pretty much no build-up in A Dance with Dragons, given that Aeron's single chapter was cut from that book and moved to the Winds of Winter, as we know from Martin's blog posts before Dance's publication. Given that fact, Euron is really a non-factor in A Dance with Dragons, save for some influence on Victarion's thoughts and viewpoints later on in the novel. With that said, we don't get any perspective on Sam or on the Reach or on the Iron Islands themselves for for any part of this book. It would really make sense that the Battle of Blood would be a great way to set the tone for the Winds of Winter, where we are establishing Euron Greyjoy as a serious, dark, almost eldritch villain, and potentially creating a massive sacrifice to wake krakens from the deep to feed his enemies, and overall set up a both darker and more magical tone for the Winds of Winter. I tweeted recently that I do think that the Forsaken chapter is going to be the first chapter in the Winds of Winter, and I do stand by that fact. It is one of my favorite chapters in the series, and I think it would be a great way to kind of set the tone and stakes for the Winds of Winter very early on. But overall, we'll see what ends up being first. I'm happy with the Battle of Blood being in the Winds of Winter. Next up is the Battle of Steel. I think this one works about equally well whether you have it in A Dance with Dragons and The Winds of Winter. If you have it in The Winds of Winter, you're able to kind of create this momentum going forward for Aegon very early on, and hopefully leading into him claiming the throne in a much more natural way. Additionally, his story in A Dance with Dragons ends in a pretty natural way, with the Golden Company and Aegon's forces arriving on Westeros and claiming their first castle, that being Jon Connington's seat at Griffin's Roost. The case for it being in A Dance with Dragons is rather more simple. That being that it seems like any battle might be good towards the end of the book, given that maybe there should be more of a climax in terms of actual conflict there. And I mean, it'd be more Jon Connington chapters that we wouldn't have to wait 13 years for. So I wouldn't be opposed to the Battle of Steel being in A Dance with Dragons. But with that said, I do think it works quite well in the Winds of Winter if it is going to happen. If it's not going to happen, and it is a subversion, as I've kind of speculated many years ago at this point, I do think it also works well in the Winds of Winter, as the gap between A Dance with Dragons and that novel leads for more time to kind of speculate and figure out whether or not there is actually going to be some fight over this castle. The Battle of Ice is up next. I do really wish this one was in A Dance with Dragons, but I can understand why Martin didn't put it there. I think that the main reason that the Battle of Ice isn't in A Dance with Dragons is given the fact that A, it would require another couple chapters of build-up, and the book simply didn't have that space, and B, I think it disrupts some of the endings for some of the characters involved. Most specifically, I love Theon's ending in A Dance with Dragons. I think it's one of the best in the series. I think his final chapter is near perfect, and it's one of my favorites in the book. But I do think that if he were to still play a role in the Battle of Ice, as he seems to with a sample chapter from the Winds of Winter, I think that really wouldn't lend itself well to actually being the ending of this very important character's arc. With that said, getting Stannis in the Crofters Village, that does seem like it is pretty much set up. It is in the correct place for it to happen. But overall, it's unclear as to whether or not it could have worked within this book, just in the page limits that exist for a physical novel. It is also worth noting that Stannis's march through the North is a massive focus throughout the latter half of this book, and it could be good to have some payoff for that. I think that it is just a little disappointing that this one got saved for wins, but overall, it's by no means necessary or load bearing in terms of the end of Dance. This brings me to what I'm sure you've surmised is my main issue with the ending of A Dance with Dragons, that being that the Battle of Fire is absent. The Battle of Fire involves so many viewpoint characters and so many different character arcs and stories that it is insane that it did not happen in the end of A Dance with Dragons. Specifically because we essentially see the very lead up to it. We see it almost start at the end of Barrison's last chapter, The Queen's Hand, but then we don't get any payoff after that. I think that the main thing that kind of irks me with this battle is the inefficiency of Tyrion's storytelling. Tyrion's final two chapters in A Dance with Dragons and first two chapters in The Winds of Winter, which we already have as samples, are very, very similar. They all involve kind of wheeling and dealing with the Second Sons and Ben Plum and trying to play Syvas and convince them to join his and Daenerys' side. And overall, they're decent chapters. They have some great moments throughout that I really enjoy, but they're really kind of meandering and really don't contribute anything to the overall story. If these four chapters were condensed into two chapters, which I think could be done relatively easily, and instead of the two chapters being added in addition to just being Tyrion's, we got maybe one more Victarion chapter and one more Barristan chapter, and we actually got to see the Battle of Fire begin to play out. I think it would make so much more sense for the story, and I think it would leave Dance in a much better place. I also think the structure of actually writing a book needs to be considered here as well, given the fact that Martin now needs to open The Winds of Winter by both kind of recapping what happened in A Dance with Dragons, because not everyone is going to be as obsessed with this series as I am, and people might need a refresher on what happened 13 years ago, and also needing to have a massive battle take place at the same time that that recap is kind of happening. A Dance with Dragons starts out with some chapters that are pretty similar to this. Jon 1, Daenerys 1, they're both very recap heavy. Tyrion one as well. And I think that all of these very much would be kind of made a lot worse if they also had to juggle a battle happening at the same time. I think that having some recaps take place in the aftermath of a massive battle, if the Battle of Fire had at least started or mostly happened already, as of the end of A Dance with Dragons and beginning of The Winds of Winter, it could be great having a chapter at the very opening of this book with Tyrion navigating the fallout from this new status quo in the city of Meereen, with which he's entirely unfamiliar, but still trying to make a name for himself and play the Game of Thrones, rather than having to get into it just in the middle of the action with two chapters that are pretty similar to chapters we already got in *The Dance with Dragons*. I will also say that I love a lot of the end of character arcs in A Dance with Dragons. I think the end of Jon's character arc is near perfect. I think the end of Daenerys' character arc is near perfect. I think that a lot of characters, Theon as well, have good ends to their arc. But overall, I think that the actual story itself and the plot, and along with it, a lot of the minor viewpoint characters like Victarion, Barristan, I wouldn't say Tyrion's a minor viewpoint character, but he's tied into this as well. They really don't have any good endings because they're actual kind of moment of realization and this massive climax that they've been building towards for the entire novel just kind of cuts off before the actual end of the book itself, and we really don't get to see them ever again. I do think that other stories might suffer from this as well, but they really don't have it to the same extent. I think I've had the thought that, man, I wish that we actually got to see Cersei's trial at the end of A Dance with Dragons, but I can see why we didn't, and I think that if we had, it would really mess up the epilogue, which is also one of the strongest chapters in the book. So overall, that I understand. But A Dance with Dragons, while being a very strong book and one of my favorites in the entire series, it does have a pretty large flaw in my eyes in terms of the ending really lacking any sense of climax. We all know the real battle that should have been in Dance is Rook's Rest. Get hype! What do you think of A Dance with Dragons and its ending? Would you have moved all or any of these battles to A Dance with Dragons? What do you think is going to happen in these battles in the Winds of Winter? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I'll have much more coming in the near future. I'll probably do a House of the Dragon video this upcoming weekend, which is why this one's coming out a little early. So yeah, it should be a fun time going into season 2. I'm really looking forward to it, and we'll see what's to come. I thank you all for joining me. Be sure to leave a comment, like, subscribe, all the typical YouTube stuff. It helps me grow the channel, and I really appreciate it. And it's free, and it's easy, and all that stuff. Thank you again for watching, and I will see you in the very near future. Goodbye, everyone.